I will share my screen.
Doesn't matter.
All right. So thanks everybody for coming. My idea is to just share a little bit about owls in general and some specifics about the species of owls that you might find here in New Hampshire and other parts of New England, and finish up with some things that we can do to help owls out in our neighborhood. I think probably all of us have known what an owl looks like from when we were pretty small. When we were in kindergarten, we could probably recognize what an owl looks like. They're kind of short and stocky, and some of them have these big funny ear tufts on top of their head. They have great big eyes. So most of us recognize a bird as an owl when we see it. Probably the most striking adaptation or tool that they have is their large eyes. All owls have large eyes. They're forward facing on the front of their face. That allows for better binocular vision and depth of field. They have a sharp curved beak. That's essentially their knife and fork for ripping and tearing their food. And then they have strong grasping or kind of raptorial feet, which are very powerful toes with long, sharp talons for grabbing their prey. So those are some of the tools or adaptations that they have to help them with the kind of hunting they do and the lifestyle that they have. Most of us have always heard, I've often heard that they have excellent hearing, which they do. You look at this great horn on the left-hand side with those big ear tufts. Those aren't actually their ears. They're just feathers on top of the head that help them communicate, but not through their voice or help them hear. Their ears are actually located down on the side of their head. So where this barred owl is on the right has a nice big, what's often referred to as a facial disc, which is a circle of feathers around their face that helps funnel the sound to their ears. And their ears are actually hidden behind that last layer of feathers of their facial disc. And they have a special flap of skin there with feathers that they can move around to help funnel the sound to their ears. So they have much better hearing than many other birds actually do. And the really funny thing or cool thing about owls is they have asymmetrical ears. So if you look at this great horned owl skull here, there's an ear high up on this side and lower down. They're kind of lopsided. And they look a little funny when there's no feathers on them, but certainly they're hidden by the you actually see them. So take a minute to think a little bit about why that would be an advantage. Well, the sound reaches those ears at two different times, and they're much better adapted for kind of triangulating on where that sound is coming from and figuring out whether it's coming from high or low, and they can pinpoint exactly where that sound will be coming from. Another important adaptation that owls have is they have long, broad wings. And those long, broad wings aren't flapped as quickly as some smaller wings of other birds. It gives them a little bit more opportunity to sneak up on their prey by being very quiet. And then the feathers themselves help muffle that sound as well by being covered with a fine, it's almost like a fuzz over the surface of their flight feathers. And then the leading edge of the wing, right along here where my thumb is, has a little bit of a serration to it. So those the edge of those feathers helps break up the sound of the air as it goes over their wings. So silent flight and sneaking up on their prey is an important strategy for owls. We often look at owls and we kind of see them as short, stumpy looking animals. They don't look like they have much of a neck. But if you look at the skeleton of an owl, they have a very long neck. They have about 14 vertebrae in their neck, which is different than mammals. All mammals, you and me and giraffes and mice, have 7 neck vertebrae, but owls have 14. And in fact, most birds have longer necks and many more vertebrae than mammals do. Gives them the flexibility to move their heads around and see behind them and reach their preen gland at the base of their tail. Owls do really well with that long, flexible neck because their eyes are so large in their head that there's not really any room for muscles to move those eyes around. And they're more of a kind of cylindrical eye than an eyeball, a round ball. And they're supported by these bony rings in the skull that keep them in place. So owls can't move their eyes in their socket. In fact, most birds don't move their eyes very much in their sockets because their eyes are so large in their head. And that flexible neck, is a great advantage for birds. So that's a little bit about the adaptations and the tools that owls have. Virtually all owls have those tools in one form or another. Let's take a look at some of the owls that we have here in New Hampshire. So a great horned owl, one on the right, is one of the largest owls that we have in Hampshire. It is the largest owl. It stands at about 2 feet or a little bit more tall. The nice yellow eyes that they have and the long ear tufts are characteristics of great horned owls, and that kind of rufous colored facial disc around their eyes. It's not perfectly round, but it gives them that distinctive character of the great horn. And you'll look at the feet here, the bottom of his feet. There are 2 toes in the front, and then around back there are another 2 toes. They have 4 toes, but 2 toes in front and 2 in back are an arrangement that works really well for owls to grasp onto branches and grab their prey. Another very common owl in New Hampshire is the barred owl, a little bit smaller than the great horned. And if you look at those two, take a minute to see the differences between not only the color of their feathers, the plumage, but also their face. You'll notice that barred owls have dark eyes, great horned owls have yellow eyes, and barred owls are missing those ear tufts at the top of their head. They have a much rounder kind of shape to their facial disc than great horned owls do. The barred owls are probably the one owl that I see and hear the most, one that I see during the day as well. So they're fairly common in the state of New Hampshire and across North America. And then the smallest owl that you'll find in New Hampshire that's a resident breeding owl is the saw-whet. They stand about 6 inches tall. They're pretty small. They weigh about 100 grams. So that's about 100 paper clips if you want to try and picture what that would feel like. Their characteristics are these rufous color stripes they have on their breast and that nice white kind of eyebrow that they have around both eyes. So those are the 3 most common owls that we'll have around in our area in New Hampshire. Screech owls are found in the state. They're more of a southern bird, so they'll be found breeding in the southern part and then moving further south along the east coast, you'll find them. So are found in the west. There's a western screech owl as well as the eastern screech owl. And they come in 2 different color phases. There's a rufous phase and a gray phase, sometimes the same colors in the same nest. The barn owl is not very common in New Hampshire. They're more of a southern, east coast and western species, but occasionally they show up in the southern part of New Hampshire. I think there's one case of a breeding pair in the state many years ago, but not a regular resident. And then we have long-eared and short-eared owls. The short-eared owls, again, are a species that's not very common here, and in much of its range, it's listed as a species of special concern because they are more adapted for wide open fields and marshes, and that habitat is limited for where they can be. So they're in the southern part of the U.S. and out west, some places up north, not very common here in New Hampshire. And then the long-eared owl, you can probably guess where it got that name, from those long ear tufts on top of its head. Pretty secretive owl. It's been found widespread in the state, but not very common. And they are an owl of more of a forested and shrub type habitat than the open field of the short-eared owl. We have a number of winter visitors to the state. The largest owl is the great gray, and that's actually the largest owl in North America. It actually stands pretty close to 30 to 36 inches tall, although in weight, it's about the same weight as a great horned. But this large facial disc, perfectly round almost facial disc, is a key characteristic for great grays. Another northern visitor is the Boreal Owl, which is a kind of northern spruce fir forest species that's found across the boreal forest of Canada and northern parts of New England and northern parts of Montana, Idaho, parts of Colorado. They're a higher elevation species. And there is one record that I know of a boreal owls, young boreal owl family found in the White Mountains in 2001, I think it was. So they could be around. They're pretty secretive, and they're at higher elevations where most people don't wander in the wintertime. And then the northern hawk owl is another northern species that lives in kind of more open places of the boreal forest up in Canada and Alaska. And then probably the one you hear about quite a bit in the winter down around here is the snowy owl. They're an Arctic breeder, so this is not their normal year-round home, but they do venture south in years when there's not as much food in the north, or there's an abundant population of young owls dispersing. And you'll hear reports of them at the Portland Jetport in Maine and down along the coastal areas of New Hampshire and Maine, where they often feed in areas that are similar to the habitats of wide open treeless areas that they use in the summertime in the north. So those are in generally the species that you'll find here as residents or visitors. And then we'll take a few minutes to talk about sort of the day in the life of an owl or the night in the life of an owl, depending on the different owl species. During the day, most owls are resting or sleeping, preening, finding a place that's sheltered from the weather. There are some that hunt during the day, but most are nocturnal. And where they roost, they're looking for a place where they can blend in and are camouflaged with their surroundings, hidden in the vegetation, protected from predators that might be looking for a snack. And also those pesky birds like chickadees and nuthatches and blue jays that often harass them when they're found. In fact, that's a really great way to find owls daytime in your area is by listening to other birds and watching their behavior. Small birds tend to mob owls and hawks where they find them. And if you listen to that commotion, you can sometimes find owls roosting in a tree nearby. Some of the owls are, as I said, are diurnal, spend most of their time active during the day, but there are some that are crepuscular, which means they're active at dawn and dusk. And virtually any owl will take advantage of hunting. If they haven't had much food the night before, if it's daytime, they'll certainly take advantage of a squirrel or a mouse that runs underneath their perch if they're hungry. They can see really well at night in the limited light, but they also see perfectly fine during the daytime. And the hunting strategies of owls are pretty similar. They all kind of lock in to their prey with their eyes and their ears, use their wings and their tail as a brake, and then reach out with their feet to grab their prey. And either grab their prey and then kill it with a bite to the back of the neck with their beak, or kill it with their sharp talons that they have. Most of the owls around New Hampshire, the great horns and barred owls and saw-whet owls are perch hunters. They kind of sit and wait for opportunities to present themselves to hunt. Then they listen and look and locate something, sometimes underneath the snow. So their hearing is so fine that they can detect that sound underneath the snow, drop down, punch through the snow with their feet or their head, and grab their prey. I have a quick video that I'm going to show, it's going to take a few minutes to, or a minute to load, and I'm going to advance it a little bit so that we don't have to watch the whole thing. But I wanted to give you a sense of how animals or how owls hunt. Each species is a little bit different in what they eat and how, but they definitely have some common characteristics. So this is a northern hawk owl. See how quickly and easily they can move that flexible neck around, spot something or hear something. They hunt in wide open areas where they can listen and look for voles underneath the snow or mice underneath the snow, and then reach out with their feet and try and grab it. Like in most predators, not always successful, but sometimes owls will stay on the ground and actually kind of paw through the snow and through the leaf litter and try and grab that prey, even if they miss it the first time. So again, going back up and doing some more listening and watching, getting the feathers realigned, doing a little shake there, and taking off again. And if you want to watch owl videos, there are plenty online. There's lots of YouTube videos on owls hunting. So what it's doing there, it's caught its prey, it's mantling, which is when it spreads its wings, it's covering its prey, it's looking around. Typically they won't stay on the ground to feed because they're kind of at risk for other birds to come in after them. So they'll take their prey away to a safer place, usually in the trees, to feed on it. So as I said, there's lots of videos out there. There's a great video on showing barred owl hunting a chipmunk on the ground, which is pretty interesting. Oops. So what do owls eat, whether they hunt during the day or night? Most of us think of owls as Mother Nature's living mousetraps. Eat a lot of rodents, mice and voles, flying squirrels for those owls that are more nocturnal, red squirrels, gray squirrels, all kinds of different rodents make up a good part of their diet. But beyond that, a number of owls specialize on other types of animals. There's an owl out west that specializes on beetles and moths. Barred owls are generalists. They'll eat just about anything they can find, including frogs and salamanders, snakes, other reptiles, lizards, if they're in an area that supports lizards. The screech owl here is taking an earthworm to its young in the nest box. So the diet is pretty varied, and the diet also varies where they're located. So a barred owl that lives in New Hampshire's diet might vary a little bit from a barred owl that lives in Florida, or a great horn that lives up in Canada versus swamps of Florida. So their diet is going to vary a little bit on where they're located. Make up part of their diet, or at least some of owls' diets. Great horns and barred owls will eat birds. Some of the screech owls will eat smaller songbirds. Snowshoe hares, even predators like weasels will get taken as well. And it's a little bit of a two-way predator relationship there, in that weasels and martins and fishers will also take young owls if they can get the opportunity on the ground. So there's another option. And then skunks and porcupines. Obviously, the smallest owl in New Hampshire, the saw-whet, can't take those for food, but great horned owls have been known to catch and kill skunks and porcupines. And if you think about how skunks and porcupines protect themselves, they use their defenses when they are frightened. And if the owl is quiet and sneaks up on their prey, neither of those defenses are utilized. hopefully the great horn can get in without getting quills or get in without getting a direct spray in the face by the skunk. Porcupines and skunks, a great horned owl can't swallow that animal whole. They'll tear off bite-sized pieces, but they'll eat virtually anything that they can take into their mouth. In the case of a saw-whet or some of the other larger owls, if they catch a mouse, they'll swallow it whole, or sometimes they'll rip off and eat the head and then swallow the rest whole. And interestingly, owls can't really digest the bones and the hair of that prey, even though they're eating everything, the tail and the toenails and the whiskers and the skull. The digestive enzymes in their stomach can't deal with the bones. So their gizzard, which is their muscular stomach, kind of packs up all the bones and the hair and the feathers and things like that, and turns it into a pellet. And then they basically regurgitate that or throw it up, usually once a day or twice a day, depending on how much they've eaten. If you take those pellets apart, you can look at what they've actually eaten. There's jaw bones in the case of this pellet. There's some leg bones over here. And following tearing apart pellets, either under roosts or from nests, is much of how scientists have figured out what owls eat, just by looking at those pellets and pulling them apart and seeing what parts are there. So if it's a mammal, it's got jaw bones. If it's a bird, there are feathers. Some of the insect exoskeletons don't get digested very well, so they'll pass through in a pellet as well. So that's a little bit about where they eat and how they eat, and sort of their daily daily events. Then there's seasonal events that happen in an owl's life. One of them is the breeding season. So right now in the wintertime is the season of love, so to speak, for many owls, including barred owls and great horned owls. And unlike other birds that use bright colors to attract their mate, owls primarily use their voice. And so learning their calls is a great way to identify where they are and figure out where their territories are. Barred owls have a basic call, which is the "who cooks for you all," and then they have a number of different calls back and forth to each other. So a great resource if you're looking for where to hear different owl songs is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They have a great library of sounds of many, almost all the different birds, but owls especially. And you can listen to several different calls from all across the country and hear some of the variations in those calls. So great horned owls, this one up on the left, gets probably the earliest start with breeding. They're on eggs right now in their nest, if not in January. So January, February is when they start. And like all, or most owls rather, they don't build their own nests. They're not known to be nest builders. They use the nests of other birds. So crows and ravens around here, hawks, eagles, ospreys, great blue herons, those are all nests that get used by some of the owls like great horns and long ears that take advantage of other birds' nests. The great horned owl, I don't have a good recording for a great horn, so I'll give you my own version, which probably isn't as good as a great horn. It's quite a bit deeper than barred owls, but it's a woo, 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 woo. And they'll repeat that several times. And then they have a number of other calls that they also will do when they're talking back and forth to each other. Usually the male is the one that's most vocal, attracting a female to his territory and nest site. And then the long have a deeper call. That one's pretty faint. don't know if you can hear that one, but that's sort of a single hoot that's spaced much more than a great horned owl. So if they don't build their own nests, they use cavities in dead trees or snags, places where branches have rotted out, like this screech owl, which has a whinny song, and also another call that they use. So they're quite vocal, but they'll use places where there are cavities in trees. And saw-whet owls use old woodpecker holes in many cases. So they can use rotted places in trees as well, but they often use pileated woodpecker holes for their nest site. Here's their song. Sounds a little bit like one of those buses backing up or a truck backing up, that beeping sound. Oh. The tops of trees that are broken off are other nest sites for great horns to use, and barred owls sometimes will use the top of broken off trees. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a cavity or a nest built by another bird. The short-eared owl is one exception to the non-nest building owls. They do pull together grasses on the ground. They live in open fields and wetlands, grasslands, and they pull together a little pocket of grasses on the ground where they lay their eggs. And then snowy owls, so we don't have them around here, lay their eggs on the ground, and they do pull together some around that spot as well. So most of them are tree dwellers, but there are definitely some that on the ground as well. So owl eggs are very similar to chicken eggs in size, although they're more rounded than they are oval with that pointy end like a chicken egg. And the number of eggs they lay depends on the species, anywhere from 2 to 4 in the case of a great horn to over 10 or so in the case of a short-eared owl or long-eared owl. And it can often depend on how much food there is. In a year when there's lots of food around, the female's in good health, she'll produce more eggs than she would if there wasn't as much food. And one of the interesting things about owls when they lay their eggs is that the female will lay an egg and she'll start incubating right away. And then 2 days later, sometimes as much as a week later, she'll lay another egg, continue incubating, lay the rest of her clutch several days apart. So the end result is the young in the nest all are of different ages. So if you look at these barn owls, you'll notice the tallest one in the middle there looks the oldest. It's got almost a fully formed facial disc, not as many downy feathers, and pretty well formed feathers on its wing. And then the one that's below it right here, its facial disc is not as fully formed and has much more down on it. So one of the advantages is that in a year when there isn't as much food, at least the older chicks in the nest may survive. They're stronger and they do a better job of begging for food when the female and male deliver food and kind of win out on the food supply chain and survive while they don't necessarily make it. So it takes about 28 to 35 days for eggs to hatch, depending on the species. And then the young will stay for anywhere from 28 to 45 days, depending on the species. Great horned owls stay in the nest a little bit longer. And of course, you can imagine the space for all those young ones gets tighter and tighter, and they end up having to kind of move out of the nest, sometimes even before they're ready to fly. They may have flight feathers that are almost fully formed, but they don't have the skills yet to fly. but they'll branch out and move their way out of the nest. And wherever they go, they'll continue to beg for food, and the adults will continue to feed them. Usually most of the way through the summer, in the case of some of our New England owls. They take a long time to reach adulthood. And it takes a long time through the summer of learning how to hunt and miss things and catch things and walk around on the ground and find whatever they can to eat while the adults are still feeding them. Most of the young owls, when they first leave the nest, are look very similar to the adults, but that's not always the case. In the case of the saw-whet owl, the littlest owl we have in New Hampshire, the adult has these buffy color stripes. The young fledglings, right after they've left the nest, have these buffy colored breasts that are quite beautiful, but very distinctive white eyebrows that give them a lot of character. So once they've left the nest, they do end up on the ground sometimes, and will continue to beg for food wherever they are. So if you ever are wandering in the woods and you find an owl on the ground, don't necessarily assume that it needs help, because it may just be a young one that's left the nest and didn't find its way back up into the trees yet, and the adults may still be feeding it. So we can talk a little bit more about how you might figure out whether something really needs help or not at the end of these slides. So all these owls vary somewhat in the kind of habitat that they need, but as is true with all wildlife, wildlife needs food and cover or shelter and water and a space to raise their young. Those are the 4 components of habitat that apply to owls too. And for some owls, they need some dense habitat for nesting. Some owls need wide open spaces for foraging for food or hunting, and need wetland areas where they can feed on frogs or salamanders. So their habitats vary, and the number of owls that you find in an area often depends on what parts of the habitat components are there for them and available. So some things that you can do for owls is thinking about your own yard or your own woodlot that you might have, and how you might be able to adjust things for owls and for other birds as well. House on the left, obviously that nice mowed lawn might be good for robins to find worms in, but the house on the right has much more diversity in the kind of the structure of the vegetation that's there and the different species. There's more mice and insects and other birds that are living there. So much more diversity in terms of food that might be available for owls. And then having large, big old trees like that wolf pine that's down in the right-hand corner. That's a great tree that will someday die off and provide good spotted habitat for owls and other species to live in. And then having a diversity of small openings around the edges of woods is always helpful for owls that tend to be perch hunters and look for openings to hunt in. So those are some things you can kind of look at in your neighborhood, in your backyard, to help owls out. The other things that you can do, one of the components that some of our cavity nesting owls really need are cavities to nest in. And if there aren't big old dead trees with rotten spots in them or woodpecker holes, you can add that to a habitat in your area by building various nest boxes. And there are all kinds of different nest box plans that are available. If you go to the ornithology, you can find plans for many different species. Barred owls and screech owls will use holes in boxes. You can make platforms for great horned owls, or some of the other owls that will use platforms or baskets or things like that. So you can get all sorts of ideas for that. And the more owls you have in your backyard, probably the less you will have in terms of rodents. This little redback vole you might not find in your house, but I'm sure if you're like me, you found lots of mice living in your house. And the more predators we have around, whether they're owls or hawks or foxes or weasels, the less of these rodents we'll have around as well. And I wanted to put that rodent picture up just to remind, to make a plea that if you're getting rid of mice in your house, to use something like a snap trap as opposed to various poisons. The poisons that are used for mice in your house are basically anticoagulants. And if an owl or a hawk eats that mouse that has recently eaten those little pellets, they suffer the same consequences as the mouse does. So snap traps or learn to live with them, either way, something you can do to help out. And then I just wanted to, excuse me, finish up with some of these websites that you can check out for more information about owls and ways that you can help owls as well. The state of New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife site has great information about the different species of owls we have, and is a great resource for any of the species that we have in New Hampshire, and they can use our support. The non-game program in the state has much funding, and they're always looking for people to be involved in what they're doing and care about what they're doing. All About Birds is the Cornell Lab Ornithology website. Project Snowstorm is a great program that tracks snowy owls. So if you're interested in maps and watching where snowy owls end up in their various movements from the north to the south and back again, they have some great maps that show all the different places they end up. They put little satellite imagery or satellite backpacks on the owls to follow them around. The American Bird Conservancy, the ABC Birds, is another great resource for birds. Owl Research Institute is one that's out in Montana, but in Montana they have many of the same species we have here in New Hampshire, and so you can learn a little bit about some ongoing research that happens with some of the owl species that are here as well. And then it's always good to know who to call when you find an injured animal, whether it's an owl on the side of the road that's been hit by a car, or you're worried about an owl you found on the ground underneath a nest. The Elaine Connors Center for Wildlife in Madison is a great resource. If you're not from around here, then you can go to your state fish and game department and look up wildlife rehabilitators, and we'll be able to find somebody nearby who can, if not help the animal you found, at least give you advice on whether that animal actually or not. So that's it for the slides. So I'm gonna unshare my screen and boop. Go back to opening up the rest of my screen. So if there are questions that you have.
Can you hear me, Lynn?
Yep.
There's a lot of questions in the chat as opposed
to. Cool. All right, I'll take a look. I'll start at the top. Microphone's muted. Is there a way to attract owls to yards or owl houses an attraction, or is that a fallacy? I don't know if it necessarily attracts them. If they have available housing, so to speak, in the forest around you, they're probably going to stick with that. If you live in an area where there aren't many dead trees or many crows or ravens or hawks that leave nests for them to nest in, they may use it. The Cornell lab that has the nest box plans also gives advice on where to locate them in terms of, most owls to nest in clusters of vegetation where there's lots of protection around those nest boxes. They're not going to necessarily nest in a wide open space where lots of other animals can find them. I hope that answered that question. There's a question about a sounds like a laugh or a horse. Is that a screech owl? It very well could be. I would go to Cornell Lab and listen to the various screech owl sounds and see if that matches what you've heard.
Lynn, there's,
Yep.
can we take a live question?
Yes.
Someone who's on a screen called Natasha, but I don't know if the person with a question is Natasha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi, my name is Say.
Natasha.
Ask your question.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I would say in endangered species.
That's a good question.
I heard owls and species, but I missed the middle part of your question.
Are
Can you
owls
say it again?
endangered? Are owls an endangered species?
So that's a great question. In New Hampshire, none of the owls that are here are listed as endangered or threatened. So that's good news. There are some owls whose numbers are dropping in various parts of the U.S. There are likely owls in other parts of the world that may be endangered that I'm not aware of. But here in New Hampshire, none are listed as endangered. That answer your question?
Yep, and I saw an owl one time.
You did? That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay. So somebody asked about a teenage daughter who's very interested in owls and birds. I'm happy to talk about owls and birds anytime. I'd love to chat with her in southern New Hampshire. So I would look at things like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Partners in Flight, are organizations that work with migratory birds, have all sorts of educational ideas, and especially has lists of all the different research projects that various scientists are working on. So that's a great place to start, I think, finding out more about that stuff. Will owls and hawks share territory? Yes, they do. Larger hawks will eat, so they're not always on good terms, but they can share mostly the same home range. So the home range is a much larger area that an animal has where all their needs are met during the course of a year, and it's a much larger area. The nest is considered their territory that they defend. So you might not necessarily find a hawk and an owl nesting in the same small territory, but they do cover the same types of habitats and do share the same kinds of home ranges. Let's see, goshawks will eat smaller owls like saw-whets right out of the nest. But I've also heard of a great horned owl that was nesting in a bald eagle nest when the bald eagles came later in the winter. So I think it just depends on the particular habitat and area. Do owl parents cooperate to raise their young? Most owls, the male supports the female while she's incubating the eggs. So she's on the eggs, the male brings food to the nest and she feeds. Then when the young reach that size where they're taking up a lot of room in the nest and can control their own body temperature, now they're covered with more feathers, the female generally leaves the nest, and then both adults will share in raising the young. that's sort of a generalization, not all owls like that. There are some females that will feed the young, and then once she's left the nest, she actually leaves and the male finishes raising the young. So it just depends on the species, but in general, both of them do. And many owls mate for life. They may not spend an entire year together, but they reconvene at the nest site or the nesting area in the winter or spring. Let's see. How are owls a benefit to ecology? Well, that's a great question. I sort of see almost any animal as a benefit to the balance of nature, so to speak. But owls are predators, like the hawks and like the fox and the weasels. So they help control the population of mice and voles and other rodents, especially insects, reptiles, amphibians. So they have a role in that kind of food chain. There's been a lot of recent discussion about the role of predators and Lyme's disease populations. So while we might think of the deer tick as being related mostly to deer, their host species is small mammals like mice, deer mice and white-footed mice. And so there's been discussion about higher populations of predators controlling the rodent population and therefore reducing the chance of Lyme's disease because of a higher population of ticks. So that's one of those ongoing research projects that is pretty cool, I think, when you don't really think about ticks and their relationship to owls or hawks in relationship to ticks, but that's pretty cool. Plumicorns, that's a good question. I've heard that ear tufts are called plumicorns. I've not heard that term, but I don't know everything. So that's interesting. I'll have to look that one up. Somebody has a great horned owl in their yard. That's pretty cool. I wonder if that means they're nesting there or you've just heard them. If owls mate and lay their eggs in winter, that must take a lot of their time sitting on the egg to keep eggs warm. Seems like an evolutionary oddity to not have the mating season at a warmer time of year. That's a great question too. So the owls that start earlier in the winter tend to have really long periods of dependence. The young are dependent on the parents for a long period of time. And it takes many predatory birds much longer to learn how to hunt and support themselves than it does something like a robin or a bluebird. So the advantage of getting started earlier in the winter means that by the end of the summer, they can, the young are getting to be mostly independent and can learn to really fend for themselves through the fall before winter really sets in. And those young ones from this year probably won't breed that first winter anyway. So they've got a few years to practice their hunting skills. So hopefully that answers the question. And that's for New England. Obviously owls that are further south, their season may vary. Burrowing owls down south and out west have a different time frame for their nesting. So it just varies by species.
Lynn?
I think I see a hand up. Is that right? Yep.
Hannah Campbell, can you hear? I'm going to ask you guys to unmute.
How big can an owl be?
How big can an owl what?
Be.
And how big can they be? So a great horned owl is about a feet tall. Barred owls are about a foot to a foot and a half. The great gray, which is the largest one in North America, is about 3 feet tall. And their weight varies. So a great horned owl weighs about 3.5 or 4 pounds. So smaller than a bag of sugar, less than a bag of sugar. And the little saw-whet owl, the smallest one that we have, 6 inches, weighs about 100 grams. if you have a bunch of paper clips at your house, you can count out 100 paper clips. That's how much that little owl weighs. That answer your question? Okay. Let's see. So a question I don't know the answer to, is there any evidence that leads us to believe that flash photography at night could cause permanent damage for an owl? I know if a bird was in flight, it could pose a significant risk, but would that be considered crossing an ethical line in your opinion? And is there any concrete data that I can be pointed to? I have not heard of it. I think it's a great question for one of the, organizations that actually does research. I think their owls' eyes are well adapted for accommodating to changes in light. They have pupils that can expand and dilate very quickly. And I would think that it wouldn't cause permanent damage, but that's my gut feeling. I think that, I think it's better to take photos during the daytime than it is at night, just because if you're using flash photography, you're interfering with their normal activity of hunting, and they need to be well fed to survive. That would be my other gut feeling, but I'm not sure that answers your question. I know that one of the issues for some of our winter visitors, like snowy owls and great grays, when they show up, they end up on a lot of the bird the bird online accounts, and many people show up to go see these unusual birds in these unusual places. And that can have an impact on that ability of that bird to survive. If there's, they're hunting or they're being harassed by too many people coming to see them, which is a great experience, it can affect how well they can feed. So I have to be a little bit careful. If you hear about a snowy owl down the road that you want to go see, just be sensitive to staying back and not spending too much time to observe and take pictures. And I think we can all appreciate how important that might be. What are anticipated changes in owl distribution and ecology as a consequence of climate change? Has there already been a change in geographical distribution as a consequence of climate change? That's another excellent question. One of the sites that I told you about, the Owl Research Institute out in Montana, has been exploring the idea of climate change on some of their long-term studies, especially with snowy owls in the north. I think it may be, I don't know specifically if there are that are extending, except maybe something like a screech owl. I've always thought of screech owls as being more of southern species, and they're showing up in southern New Hampshire now and southern Maine, where they weren't historically. I'm not sure that's related to climate change or change in habitats specifically. But it's a great question. I think if you were to look at some of the, at Cornell's studies, you might answer that question a little bit more thoroughly. I think some of it is related to the change in their prey base. So for example, snowy owls, the vole and lemming population is changing, the owl population is going to change, and who knows what the kind of melting permafrost might do for the vole population or the lemming population. So I think there are a lot of questions that don't have full answers. Climate change. Okay, so here's a question again with concrete evidence on flash use in photography and owls. I'm sure it is mostly opinion, and I'm not sure that anybody's studied the scientific data for it. So I'm not sure where to go with that, but it might be a question you could ask one of the scientists at Cornell. and see if they can point you in the direction of that scientific data. I don't see a full screen, so if anybody's raising their hands, I'm not seeing everybody's hands, but maybe Juno can help me if there is anybody. Owls tend to return to the same nest year after year. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they return to the same territory, but use a different nest. There are Boreal owls. I spent some time working on a Boreal owl study out in Idaho when I was out of college, and many of those pairs would return to one or two of the same nest cavities each year. So it just depends on the species and the individuals.
Lynn,
Do owls attack other owls? Yep.
there's some people on the screen called Lee Warren who have questions.
Okay. Unmute. Okay. Go ahead.
My question is there an owl species that will attack humans?
Good question. So another name for great horned owls is tiger of the woods. They wouldn't attack you just for walking down a trail or attack you for thinking that you're food. But if you happen to be walking underneath their nest, they might be pretty protective of that site. So there are cases of owls dive bombing at humans as they go near their nest. That's the only way to protect their nest and their young. They can't come up to you and say, "Excuse me, please leave me alone." They have to do it the only way they know how. So if you get dive bombed by an owl, that's probably why. You're too close to the nest. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Anne, are you waving your hand? Can you unmute? Anne, you have to unmute. Juno, can you unmute her?
I'm trying, but it doesn't seem like it's working.
Okay. And I can't hear you because you're muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Anne. It's not, like it's,
While we're waiting for Anne to unmute, here's another good question. What's the biggest owl species in the world, and do we have owls? So the first question is, the biggest species, as far as I know, is the eagle owl. Owls are found on every continent except Antarctica. So they're pretty wide, and there are some species that are widespread across multiple countries. Like great horned owls are one of the most widespread species of owls. Okay, Anne, I see you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I was wondering how the owl population relates to the rodent population. Does it sound, if for some reason there's an increase in the rodent population, as we had a couple of years ago with an increase, especially in mice, does that mean effectively that owls become more populous? Is there a parallel?
It can. Yeah.
Are they dependent totally on the abundance of mice and other rodents, and do they increase as the rodent population increases during a prolific mass crop, for example?
Yes, and that's pretty true of most predators. They go in cycles. So if there's a good rodent population, there's more food for owls and hawks and other predators, and those that female can lay more eggs. And if
Yeah.
there's more for them to, they're young, there's better chance that those young are going to survive.
Yeah.
And especially for young as they're learning how to hunt on their own. So it'll definitely go in cycles. And
Yeah.
it will depend a little bit on the species too. Some species specialize specifically in mice or voles. Might have a harder time if the numbers drop, where other species have a more of a generalist diet and will substitute other animals in their diet. So the snowy owl population, for example, in the north, often fluctuates cyclically with the lemming population, because the voles and the lemmings are a big part of their diet where they nest.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I once had a barred owl follow me on a walk through the woods during late spring. Could this have been a young owl? Are certain species of owls known to be curious? That's a good question about curiosity. It wouldn't surprise me if it were a young owl. I can't really think of another reason that it would follow you, but that's a good question. I think it's interesting because barred owls, because I see more during the day and they seem to be around more, I kind of get that feeling that they are more curious, but I'm not basing that on any fact. Will owls eat discarded mice caught in snap traps, or do they prefer live catches? In general, they prefer live food, but there have been recent studies of owls feeding on roadkill on the side of the road, which is not a place for them to be. But they have been eating carcasses and scavenging the way some other hawks do. I don't know if they would eat the mouse snap trap, but if they didn't, I'm sure there would be a weasel or a chipmunk or a red squirrel or something else that would feed on that. You know, you probably think chipmunk or red squirrel is kind of odd. They have a reputation for being seed eaters, but they do eat other animals and baby birds and eggs and things like that too, even though they're cute rodent chipmunks. Do certain owls like the snow? That's another really great question. I don't know if they like it or not. I don't know if it in some cases it might be an advantage if it concentrates small mammals underneath the snow. But snow with a frozen crust, like some of the freezing rain we're getting, that makes it much more difficult to hunt. So they might not like that so much. Okay, I think we're getting down to the bottom here. That one we already answered. What animals are poisonous to owls? And is there an owl species that will attack humans? Again, attacking humans is mostly related to protection of nest or territory. And I don't know about animals that would be poisonous to owls. That's a good question. Yes, you can tell different owl species apart by the call. And again, in a lab ornithology and listen to the various calls and maybe practice them on your own, you'll start hearing some of those differences and can pay attention to them next time you're out and about. Okay, I think most of these other things I've covered.
Lynn?
Yep.
There's another question about owl boxes, if they're successful in supporting nesting. It seems like from your talk, if they don't have trees, it's useful for them to have other. places to nest.
Yeah, I think it's, yes. I think it depends on what other natural sources are available. And if there aren't any, then it's a good opportunity for offering that as one of their habitat pieces that they need. And as I said earlier, the Cornell site has information not only on building those boxes, but how to place them and where to place them, and you know, what kind of material to put down inside to keep them dry and safe. So that information is out there for learning about where to put things. Anybody else have any burning questions that I haven't answered? All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I hope you'll spend some time outside this winter at night listening for owls in your neighborhood. And if you don't know what they are, go to the Cornell site and see if you can figure out what you're listening to. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you. Okay, leave.
Perfect,
You're
terrific.
welcome.
Oh, I know her.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Great. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Very much so. Thank you. Have a good night.
I don't think the one we
Yeah,
have
you
for
too.
Lynne
Thank you.
is big enough for owls.
No. Well, you can find out how to do it.
Yeah, call them.